Hello again. Let me take you back to the good old days.
This is the BBC third programme. How to Listen, including How Not to, How You Ought to, and How You Won't, by Stephen Potter and Joyce Grenfell. How? How? How?
All ready for your instructions, are you? That didactic little announcement, believe it or not, opened the third programme when it first started broadcasting 40 years ago this week. Well, assuming that you know how to listen by now, what I have for you to listen to includes a visit to a cannibal island, what makes a pretty face, and how the Norman conquest failed to overcome the English language. Roald Dahl recalls the Archbishop of Canterbury who appeared to enjoy beating little boys. Spike Milligan looks back to his first appearance on stage in a school nativity play, and Ben Warris remembers how he fought his way into the profession by putting on a black face. The lumbering music that ushers in the work of Alfred Hitchcock. BBC Two is doing a two-part profile of the man who left the East End of London, where his father was a poultry dealer, to go to Hollywood and make his name as a master of the spine-chilling movie. We know quite a lot about Hitchcock already, because he was a great self-publicist, even to the extent of always reserving a small walk-on part for himself in his films. But quite a few new things about him emerged in conversations with those who'd worked with him closely over the years, including the scriptwriter Samuel Taylor and Charles Bennett, a regular screenwriter of Hitchcock in the 30s, who gave this account of their somewhat sybaritic working routine.
In the morning I used to get up and pick up Hitch in Cromwell Road, where he lived, at 10 o'clock exactly. And he would be sitting on the curb waiting for me with Joan Harrison, who was our secretary, sitting on the curb beside him. And sometimes it was raining at 8, but it didn't make any difference. And then we would go to the studio where we would discuss the script and things like that, and what was going on and what I was doing with it and that kind of stuff. And then at about 1 o'clock, everything would stop, and we'd go to lunch, always at the Mayfair Hotel, right there, and have a wonderful lunch, and then come back, and at that point, Hitch would usually go to sleep in the office, and I would do a little work, and possibly doze off too slightly, I don't know. But eventually, about 5 o'clock, we would go back to Hitchcock's flat in Cromwell Road, where we would start having nice cocktails for the evening, and talk more and more and more about the script. And I think more work was done on the script in the evening over cocktails than any other time.
And they shared a sense of the absurd. Even the earliest Hitchcock films are full of apparently irrelevant comic vignettes.
But I can't understand, madam. One of my best songbirds. It sang all day before you purchased it. Perhaps in a few days it will settle down.
Nothing won't make it settle down. I've tried always. Whistling to it, clapping my hands, frying bacon, no use. It just sits there and makes me look silly.
Not the bird's fault, I assure you, madam.
Isn't it? I'll have my 2 and 9, please, and there's your bird back. I want a canary for company.
Perhaps I can make him sing. There now.
You sure it was him?
Listen again.
See his beak open?
Of course you did. There's a good boy. Now, don't forget, plenty of watercress, and you must whistle to him.
Me whistle? Perhaps you'd like me to sit in the cage and him do the housework.
He was the master of the small moment, the master of the short story. And he always knew about those. He always knew what he wanted to do with those. He did not have so much of an overall view of the story he was going to tell. That's why he often got into trouble. And when he talked to you about a picture, he never told you the story. He told you scenes, his favorite scenes. And so it became, for him, it was like a mosaic. And when he finally got the entire mosaic put together, then you saw the story. Now, if he didn't have a good writer, there were going to be pieces missing in that mosaic.
part of the omnibus profile of Alfred Hitchcock. On September the 29th, 1946, the BBC opened up another radio network to be a companion to The Home and the Light, the third programme they called it, the precursor of our present Radio 3. It got off to a satirical start, with a programme compiled by two humorists of the day, Stephen Potter and Joyce Grenfell, which was broadcast again this week to mark the 40th anniversary. Rather like those television documentaries we have now, where cameras show us behind-the-scenes pictures of how a television programme is made, this was an earnest attempt at telling listeners about the components of radio. Sound effects were produced as things of wonder. Music, voices of character and colour were all wheeled on to demonstrate the wonder of wireless. But what they were really after was the perfect listener. And here, a tongue-in-cheek panel of third programme Sudes discusses the subject.
And now, I've always wanted to ask you, do you listen, Miss Fern Brixton? Miss Fern Brixton?
Ooh, yes, rather.
And why do you listen, Professor Crump?
Well, I have to listen professionally.
Ooh, really? How enormously interesting.
Well, I'm by way of being a sociologist, of course, and radio is part of the manners and customs of the human race, I suppose, as much as any other manifestation of the complexities of the human spirit.
Yes, I do see. I wonder if you happen to like my special pigeon, folk music.
Folk music is what I'm after. There is, of course, very little of it today.
Oh, I think I contradict you.
No, excuse me. I mean very little in the sense that the grand old basic tunes, at any rate of the Western people, are quickly becoming vestigial.
Yes, I see. Well, I've come to the conclusion that modern so-called swing jazz is the folk music of today. That shocks you, doesn't it? You see, I hold the view that Ginger Rogers is the voice of the people, the song voice. And in years to come, long after we've gone, that's going to be the folk music of this present era.
Or, as I put it, become the folk music of the past, which is, of course, now to us the present.
Yes, of course. You know this one, don't you? Heaven, boom, boom. I'm in heaven, boom, boom. And my heart beats so that I can hardly speak, boom, 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 boom. And then, of course, there's I say tomatoes, you say tomatoes. I say potatoes, and you say potatoes. It's a different pronunciation, of course. Oh, he's gone. Oh.
And finally, oh yes, finally, why do you listen, Mr. Pantel?
Did you ask?
I say, why do you listen?
Me? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm not an awfully good listener.
Oh, but...
In fact, I'm afraid I never do.
Well, that's impossible. Why?
I'm afraid I don't like radio very much.
You like it? There must be something. Perhaps you don't like music.
I love it, but not radio music.
Oh, you don't care tuppence for it, isn't that it? Not enough to buy the Radio Times and find out when the music you want is being played.
Oh, I know all about that. But I think I simply don't like things coming through funnels.
Oh, you're joking.
I have listened, you know. In the old days, I used to try listening a lot.
Oh, yes?
Well, it always seemed to me that first thing in the morning, it sounded like this.
There are those who resolutely refuse to hear the whispering message of the lower bowel, whose motto would seem to be, what I have, I hold. Constipation may even be due to taking medicines to cure it, to taking laxatives as a routine. Please don't whip your bowel each day into a chronic frenzy of irritable activity.
Before breakfast. And then immediately after breakfast, or even while breakfast was still going on, it sounded like this.
I love you. I love you. Oh, I love you. I love you. I love
How to Listen, a programme first broadcast in 1946 on the third programme. Edward Blishen started listening to the radio as a boy in the 30s. His later career as a writer was foreshadowed by the fact that he noted in an exercise book the things he listened to. That came in handy recently when he was asked to bid in the archive auction and made a selection of some gems of BBC sound from the past. His earliest jottings concerned listening to variety and cricket, with all the family gathered round the set. Dance band music was generally enjoyed and noted down too. But then came his personal discovery of another kind of music, which was to lead to a rift in the family.
One moment in our house the very name of Bach was an instant joke, and the next I was listening to this wonderfully explanatory voice.
We left off, to me rather provokingly, in the very middle of the third part of our talks. The first part, of course, was about the remark in music, which Beethoven made such a feature of, and which since seems to have died. This kind of thing. If there were 4 people in the room, and one made this remark, and the other answered, and a third one, puffing away at a cigarette, perhaps added this, and a fourth wise person by the fire said, "All right, you fellows." And then somebody else from a corner of the room broke out, as Beethoven does the next moment, amplifying his first thought. We should feel that something was going on, rather like a play, rather like a conversation, something very human and very communicative.
That was Sir Walford Davis, one of his talks in the series Music and the Ordinary Listener. My goodness, in me he'd got hold of a very ordinary listener, and I was never the same again. My father, poor man, thought I'd been turned into, in an undesirable sense, an extraordinary listener. He'd find me listening to infamous persons, such as this one.
I ought to warn you that some of the ideas I am putting before you may strike you as unorthodox. I shall be glad if you will hear me out, but I do not want to occupy your time on false pretenses. I am not, in the narrow sense of the word, a patriot, and I am no sort of nationalist at all. I am utterly opposed to those people who say Britain for the British and let all the rest of the world go hang. If you are one of those who make that the first principle of political life, then you will not like anything that I am going to say. I do not think you will even want to understand what I am going to say. You would do far better to switch off your receiver right now and leave me, so far as you're concerned, talking to the empty air.
H.G. Wells. Somehow I took in my stride the astonishing fact that my literary hero, as he then was, had so unheroic a voice. Well, voices. This was one of the newest, the most dangerous, the most dreadfully thrilling. W.H. Auden.
Easily, my dear, you move, easily your head. And easily through leaves of a photograph album I'm led, through the night's delights and the day's impressions, past the tall tenements and the trees in the wood, those somber the 16 skies of Europe and the Danube flood. Looking and loving our behaviors past the stones, the steels and the polished glass, lucky to love the new Pansy Railway, the sterile farms where his looks are fed, and in the policed, unlucky city, lucky his bed.
The far-back voice of revolution, 1936. My father didn't care at all for phrases like the new Pansy Railway being heard in his living room.
The archive auction on Radio 4. And I don't suppose Mr. Blishen Sr. would have been much of a fan of the £1 Million radio show either, but even they delved into the sound archive this week.
Come with us on the March of Time. The year is 1965, and the swinging 60s are in full swing, and are dominated by this sound.
I wanna hold your hand.
Yes, the unmistakable sound of the Beatles, those brilliant musicians, and Ringo, who did his best. Soon everyone was wearing Beatles wigs, including Andrew Lloyd Webber, who still wears his. As well as the Beatles, there were the Rolling Stones, led by Mick Jagger, an ex-lifeguard who could give the kiss of life to 14 people at once. And in the cinema, a new breed of actor was emerging.
OK, who's next?
My name is Michael Caine.
Yeah. Michael, tell me, why do you talk as slowly as that?
Because this is the speed that I think at. Michael Caine, the star of Alfie, which revolved around the key premise of films in the 60s, namely that working-class people are too stupid to know how to use contraceptives. 1965 was also the heyday of TV satire. David Frost was going to change the world, and 4 years later, he owned most of it. In the world of science, 1965 saw an important breakthrough in psychiatric medicine.
As you can see, gentlemen, we've identified a new psychiatric condition. A schizophrenic, as you know, may have more than one personality, but this patient has 496 personalities, all of them devious. And yet, not only does this patient have an outwardly normal life, but he's also managed to become Prime Minister.
Yes, Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, although he denies it now. In his government, Roy Jenkins was Chancellor, George Brown was Foreign Secretary, Tony Benn was Minister for Technology, and Jim Callaghan was Minister responsible for picking up George Brown. It was a time of swinging parties and extramarital sex, but all this was condemned as the permissive society by people who were too ugly to join in. But the madcap zany 60s were too much for some, and in heaven, God was bewildered.
Angel Gabriel, here.
Yes, God?
Take a look down there. What are they? What's going on down there, eh? All this 60s rubbish. Look at them. All the women wearing short skirts, even the ones I gave bad legs. And the men are all wearing polo necks and doing a dance that makes them look like Wallies. What's that called?
I believe it's called the Hitchhiker.
What is happening? Oh, and what's that awful sound?
Cilla Black.
Oh, dear. Gabriel, who's that there? I don't like the look of her. That one there. The one walking around carrying that bucket of cold water.
That's Mary Whitehouse. She's one of ours.
Oh, right. I'm going to wipe them out.
Oh.
I think I'll opt for a flood.
Now, you've hit them with a flood before.
Pestilence?
Had it.
Plague?
Had it.
Well, there must be some eternal curse I can bring down on their heads. Ah, there, look, that's it, down there, look. That woman in her early 40s, just listen to her.
I don't think that there will be a woman Prime Minister in my lifetime.
Oh, come on, please, they don't deserve that.
Shut up, Gabriel, she's perfect. If only I'd had her in Egypt, I wouldn't have had to use up all those locusts.
Meanwhile, back on unsuspecting Earth, everyone thought the fun would go on forever. Andy Warhol said everyone would be famous on TV for 5 minutes, but unfortunately Wogan came along and started taking everybody's turn. And time marches on.
Harry Enfield, Andy Hamilton and Nick Revell on the £1 Million Radio Show. Don Howarth makes television documentaries. You may remember his series about Fred Dibner, the man who blew up tall chimneys for a living and devoted his leisure to steam traction engines. Don Howarth is also well known as a radio playwright. He's won 3 Giles Cooper Awards. Now he's written his autobiography. At the age of 62, he looks back at his Lancashire childhood in the early 30s in Figures in a Bygone Landscape, which has been the Radio 4 morning reading for the past 2 weeks. His memory for the fine detail is phenomenal. Here he describes Lancashire children at play. Normally, the girls played separately from the boys. They shared the same street, he said, without quarrelling. The reader is Stephen Thorne.
The paving stones they chalked for hopscotch, the railings to which they fastened their skipping ropes and the lamp-post on which we chalked our wickets were established by custom. Mobile games, bike races, gun battles, taking dolls in prams shopping, were played in among the fixed pitches. Deliberate spoiling of somebody's game was rare and clamorously condemned. Accidental collisions were frequent. The right of rebuke belonged to girls alone. They caricatured the exasperation of women mill workers telling off the tackler. "You are a pain, lad. Why don't you watch where you're going?" My brother Eric's cowboy hat was outlawed. It had a soft crown of such depth that the cardboard brim fell over his eyes, and his blind charges with his pistol brought him down in a tangle of children, dogs, skipping ropes, prams and bikes. He was roughed up by girls, who then rounded on Dougie Cubbins, who had no hat, but was carrying a 6-shooter. "Don't wear your hat," he lisped to Eric. "It gets off the lumber. We'll have some grub." His grub was a bagful of gritty fawn lozenges his mother threw out when she stopped coughing. Their part in the Wild West was to serve as an elixir. Anyone shot would be revived with grub from Dougie's bag. Sheriffs, bad hats, posses, tribes of Indians and squadrons of US cavalry arrived from all parts of the district and died without argument. Our street looked like the marshalling yard at Atlanta, with Dougie Cubbins crawling among the wounded, breaking off smaller and smaller pieces of his dwindling supply of cough tablets, and saying to each croaking warrior, "Reckon I give you some grub, and you gets better." The dead arose with their weapons. It was sacrament, resurrection, and Valhalla all in one. Both boys and girls played with hoops of plywood, or better, of iron, which rumbled resonantly over the joins in the pavement and brought people to the door clutching their heads. Boys alone had motor tyres, which were thought unladylike. They were directionally unstable and liable at speed to cut swathes through smaller children and to strike and splatter with water that collected inside the case adults not sprightly enough to leap out of their path. The tyre became a first strike weapon. The wooden hoop became, with boys, a quoit to aim at the arm of gas lamps, the iron hoop a clamp to manacle small children to the railings. In the schoolyard, fighting was kept within bounds by the male teacher from the top class, who bore the trial of yard duty by putting himself into a trance and moving glassy-eyed through the swirl and scuffle of boys until he was snapped out by the bell or by a serious fight. He then waded in, spitting hatred, collared the contestants and marched them into the headmaster, who assaulted both of them as a lesson against violence.
Don Howarth figures in a bygone landscape. Roald Dahl was 70 this week, and he recalled boyhood beatings in a programme on Radio 4 called A Dose of Dahl's Magic Medicine. There's usually quite a bit of nastiness in Dahl's stories, an unexpected and cruel turn of events. And Peter Nichol, who presented the programme, wondered how much Dahl's life, especially his childhood, had affected the outlook of his stories. It led to this reflection from the author himself.
Mind you, the nastier you can make the man or woman in the beginning of the book, the more fun it is to see them getting their just desserts. I mean, it's tremendously satisfying. Any adult novel you write, you'd be very unhappy if there was a villain all the way through who never got caught in the end. It's just human nature.
I can think of at least one villain that you describe who never got caught in the end, Geoffrey Fisher, who later became the Archbishop of Canterbury.
He was not, in my view, a religious man at all. He wasn't a man of God. He was a very fine administrator who turned my school over some 20 or 30 years into a good school. But he was renowned for beating people very hard, which I disapprove of strongly. It wasn't only that, it was a sadistic ritual as well. He was a pipe smoker, and between each stroke he would start lighting his pipe again, which kept going out, and while he was lighting it he would be lecturing him, and then he would deliver the second of the 12 strokes. I wouldn't want to know or be friends with any human being who could do that, an adult, to a boy. The fact that he could rise to this position never did, in my view, say very much for the church. That's when I began to lose faith in it.
There's some very justifiable anger in the way you're talking, and seems to me I detect anger in some of your stories, though that's by no means the only emotion. Do you think anger's a cleansing emotion?
No, I think it's a natural emotion for any injustice anywhere in the world. I've always felt very strongly about injustices and cruelty. If you said, who would you like to be your friend or your wife or anything else, my number one virtue, I think, would be kindness. Simply that.
Certainly the stories generate considerable moral outrage against unkindness, but they use black humour to do it. Rural stories may begin gently, but they have a sting in the tail like a scorpion's.
There is a link between cruelty and laughter. It's the old story about a fellow slips in a banana skin in the street and falls down. Why do we laugh? Because the poor fellow has come an awful crash, and he's probably grazed his knees and his hand. He may even broken his wrist. But our first instinct is to laugh at him. You'll even see it with stage comics doing a routine. They use cruelty and then they explode it. And you laugh from relief, really, because nothing fearful is going to happen.
Roald Dahl on his 70th birthday. Giacomo Puccini believed that music was useless without words. He gave his librettists a hard time and made them write and rewrite La Bohème 3 and 4 times. He wanted poetry, yet he wanted the word to fit the characters and the situation exactly. With Norman Rodway as Puccini, Michael Oliver has compiled a 2-part portrait of the great Italian opera composer for Radio 4. One of the men who was commissioned to write for La Bohème was Luigi Illica. He complained loudly about Puccini's demands and about his rate of pay, but even he, surely, wouldn't have complained about the lushness of the music.
The poet has written. Now let's see if he's filled out Act 3 with poetry to Olympus soaring aesthetically. Or has that master of irony made a pig's ear from silk? Has he? Whatever he's done, it seems to me that I've set his verses excellently. Strange that such orotundity should be musicked into simplicity. Musetta and my sweet Mimi. To light a spark within my brain I seek but ever seek in vain. Tell the good poet that Mimi should be dressed in rags, not finery.
Il secolo!
March the 20th, 1893. Il secolo. Maestro Ruggiero Leoncavallo wants to make it known that he contracted for his new opera La Bohème last December and has since that time been working on the music for that subject. Maestro Puccini, to whom Maestro Leoncavallo declared 2 days ago that he was writing Bohème, confessed that only upon his return from Turin did he have the idea of putting La Bohème to music, and that he spoke of it to Illica and Giacosa, who, according to him, have not yet finished the libretto. Maestro Leoncavallo's priority as regards this opera is indisputable.
Leoncavallo is writing a Bohème. Ruggiero Leoncavallo. Lion horse. Lion beast, lion donkey. Well, there were 2 Manons. The omen is in my favor. To the editor of the Corriere della Sera, March the 21st, 1893. My dear sir, precedence in art does not imply that we must treat the same subject in identical ways. He will compose, I shall compose, and the public will judge.
Hands up all those who know the one by Leoncavallo. The Immortal Bohemian, Part 2 of which you can hear next Thursday on Radio 4, is produced by John Powell. A great favourite of mine from childhood days was included in this week's requests to Poetry Please. Rudyard Kipling was always nice and easy to memorise with his steady rhythm and sturdy rhyme. The River's Tale personifies the Thames, which proceeds to relate its history from prehistoric times. The River's Tale was read by John Franklin Robbins.
20 bridges from Tower to Kew, 20 bridges or 22, wanted to know what the river knew, for they were young and the Thames was old. And this is the tale that the river told. I walk my beat before London town, 5 hours up and 7 down. Up I go till I end my run at Tide End town, which is Teddington. Down I come with the mud in my hands and plaster it over the Maplin sands. But I'd have you know that these waters of mine were once a branch of the River Rhine, when hundreds of miles to the east I went, and England was joined to the continent. I remember the bat-winged lizard birds, the age of ice, and the mammoth herds, and the giant tigers that stalked them down through Regent's Park into Camden Town. And I remember like yesterday the earliest Cockney who came my way, when he pushed through the forest that lined the Strand with paint on his face and a club in his hand. He was death to feather and fin and fur. He trapped my beavers at Westminster. He netted my salmon, he hunted my deer, he killed my heron off Lambeth Pier. He fought his neighbour with axes and swords, flint or bronze, at my upper fords. While down at Greenwich, for slaves and tin, the tall Phoenician ships stole in, and North Sea warboats, painted and gay, flashed like dragonflies, Erith way. And Norseman, and Negro, and Gaul, and Greek drank with the Britons in Barking Creek. And life was gay, and the world was new, and I was a mile across at Kew. But the Roman came with a heavy hand, and bridged, and roaded, and ruled the land. And the Roman left, and the Danes blew in. And that's where your history books begin.
Rudyard Kipling's The River's Tale. Well, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is one of our oldest history books, and it was quoted from this week in The Story of English on BBC Two, presented by Robert McNeill. This week traced the early developments in our mother tongue, when the language of the ancient Britons was pushed out of the way by the invading Angles, whose language subsequently had some corners rubbed off it by the Danes. The Viking hordes didn't manage to overmaster our language, but it came under a tougher threat in the year 1066.
Harold Godwinson was to be the last English-speaking king for nearly 300 years. The third and most famous invasion in this story began in France. Duke William of Normandy assembled a fleet and launched his forces across the Channel. In the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, then William, Earl of Normandy, came to Pevensey.
There kom Wilhelm, Earl of Normandy, into Pevensey.
Harold the king gathered then a great army.
Harold the king gathered there mikkel na here.
William came against him unawares before his people were assembled.
Wilhelm him kom ongen on unware, his folk gefulker were.
There was slain King Harold and many good men, and the French wielded power over that place of slaughter.
There werth of slacken Harold the king, and fella godra man, andra frinkiskan achton, wellstoa je wel.
The word castle comes from French, and this was now the language spoken by the Norman knights in their English strongholds. As one chronicler put it, when England fell into Norman hands, they spoke French as they did at home.
Thus komen though Engelande into Normandies hande, and though Normans ne kutha speker though botter ure speche, and speak French as they do at home, and their children did also teach.
William tried to learn English at the age of 43, but was too busy to keep it up. Many Anglo-Norman kings were often totally ignorant of their country's language. Edward III could use English only for swearing. Government, law, and administration were conducted in French, and so was the English Church. In the great cathedrals like Durham, the Normans slowly purged the English-speaking bishops. Next to French, Latin was the language of the clerks and clergy. In the year 1155, the English monks who wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle abandoned their work forever. Going by the written record, English seems to have become obliterated. But some scholars, like Michael Clanchy, challenged the view that Anglo-Norman society was wholly French-speaking.
Scholars have perhaps been misled because we are taught and learn to respect writings, and of course that is what has survived, these masses of writings, whereas speech has been lost.
There's good evidence here, says Clanchy, that the Normans became quickly integrated into English society.
A contemporary of around 1180 says that by that time the Normans and English were so intermarried as to be indistinguishable.
Clanchy can demonstrate, in fact, that by 1250, Anglo-Norman children were learning French like a foreign language.
You can show from 1250, from a knight called Walter of Bibbsworth wrote a book designed for English-speaking people to show them how to speak French. And so French was a language which educated people could speak, but I think it was, by and large, a learned language.
The story of English. Not content with taking the English language all over the world, and some would say imposing it on colonial territories, our ancestors also sought to impose their ideas, their way of government, their Christian religion and such. Our imperial past is well documented, but there's one pioneer who appears to have been forgotten. Ronald Knox Moore has righted that wrong in his Islands of Hope and Glory, which was read by Frank Duncan on Radio 4. The name of Lady Bertha Frampton is certainly not one I've come across before. It was she who was responsible for establishing the Imperial Temperance Movement. With her husband, Sir Horace Frampton, Bart, she spent 10 years documenting the prevalence of alcoholism in the British colonies. Unhappily, on one of their expeditions, Sir Horace died of cholera, contracted through drinking water. His widow continued with the good work, sustained by a second husband, Walter, the harmonium player at her Sussex Hall rallies.
"We shall be leaving for the Cannibal Isles," she informed him 4 weeks after the wedding. It was the morning of Lady Bertha's 60th birthday. "The Baronet and I docked there on our way back from New Zealand," she recalled. She put down alongside her crochet the latest number of the Teetotal Progressionist. "I sent Horace ashore on his own. He confirmed my worst fears. The sins of alcoholism were the worst in the whole of the empire." She took a paper knife and sliced open an invitation to address the Southwark Band of Hope. "I've felt a call to the South Seas ever since." "I am a lucky man," Walter had assured himself when Lady Bertha proposed to him. He was not so sure about this when they were boarding their steamer at Tilbury in the teeth of a North Sea gale. However, they had the very best cabin, from which Walter did not emerge until the ship reached the calmer waters of the Pacific. Then he took up a perch on deck, like a sparrow, at the foot of Lady Bertha's chaise longue. "My wife cannot abide intemperance," he explained to the captain, "particularly among the cannibals." Captain Langford nodded approvingly. Lady Bertha, voluminous in her silks, reminded him of his days under sail. At last, on Easter Sunday, they anchored off Leuvaca, the capital of the Cannibal Isles. Captain Langford needed no compass to guide him into the harbour. He merely followed the line of empty gin bottles floating out from Leuvaca on the evening tide. The little port was a rowdy settlement of beachcombers and runaway convicts from the Australian penal territories. The visitors stayed with Edgar Bayard, the British consul, who happened to be a distant relative of Sir Horace Frampton. "Great-uncle Horace was fond of a good claret," said their host, his hand on the decanter at the dinner table. "Not once he was married to me," snapped Lady Bertha. To the astonishment of the consulate staff, she removed the stopper and discharged the contents into a vase of hibiscus flowers. All conversation rapidly petered out. The principal bedroom, where Lady Bertha and Walter retired with an overnight glass of Epsom salts, adjoined Leuvaca's principal hotel, the Polynesia. The noise from under its tin roof grew more riotous by the hour. "Now you can hear for yourself how sorely they need temperance here," said Lady Bertha, throwing back the mosquito net. Walter, his little pink ears flattened between the pillows, smiled wistfully. Poor ignorant natives, she sighed, poisoning their systems with alcohol. She was not to know that the natives were excluded from the hotel and that they had other ways of poisoning their systems. Only recently they had cooked the Reverend Joseph Barker, Baptist minister on Coca de Levitou, in his Wellingtons, and digested him, boots and all.
Frank Duncan reading from Islands of Hope and Glory by Ronald Knox Moore. What makes a face attractive? We all have our own ideas about that, but there are generally accepted norms about who's attractive and who isn't. To try and measure these criteria, an American scientist set up a study. Using his students at Elmhurst College in Illinois as guinea pigs, Dr. Michael Cunningham tried to discover if there were features that operate universally to attract others. His results were discussed on Science Now by Dr. Chris McManus with Peter Evans. It was interesting to note the unconscious bias in the males involved in this exercise, who, when discussing facial beauty, automatically assumed female beauty. Consequently, the students at Elmhurst were asked to look at 50 photographs of girls, of different ethnic backgrounds, all smiling. Some were college students, others were beauty queens. Their responses indicated that 4 separate features of the face are particularly important.
An attractive face was one with a small nose, with wide eyes, so that the upper and the lower eyelid were wide apart, with a wide mouth and a narrow chin. And this was the optimal combination for looking attractive.
Now, as someone with none of those features, I think, why should they have been attractive?
Well, there are a whole range of possible reasons. One is that that's just what people happen to like, but I don't think that's a very acceptable explanation, and what Cunningham is doing is starting to look at more biological explanations. What he's saying is, well, which sort of individuals do we find attractive naturally in biological terms? And of course, probably the strongest form of attraction or bonding is between a mother and a child. And what Cunningham is arguing is that we find attractive those features which make individuals look most childlike, and that we're thereby in some way producing the same sort of bonding process that would be induced in us by a child. And all of these characteristics of the neonate, the newborn baby, and newborn babies look very different to adults. The whole shape of their face is different.
So, effectively, these college students were rating these girls, these photographs, on the sort of baby doll look?
To a certain extent, yes, and at least when they were rating them for attractiveness. But if we start to look at other ratings, which he made later on in the same experiment, we find that those characteristics don't always come through. So that, for instance, the subjects were asked to rate whether or not they were likely to hire a person for a job. And there we find that the expressive features come out, things like having eyebrows that are high above the eyes. These are apparently giving almost the beginnings of a smile. And these seem to be important features in hiring for a job. Whereas willingness to lend money to somebody or to make an investment with them, that seems to be related to the size of the nose, but for instance there to the largeness of the nose. And what we seem to be finding here is that the more mature features seem to be coming out. You'd lend money to somebody who seemed to be an adult, not somebody who seemed to be a child.
Let's go back specifically to attractiveness. Now, why should it be that the newborn baby features are attractive to adult males?
Well, I think we've got to ask, first of all, why the newborn baby is attractive to adults at all. And there, of course, are very good biological reasons. The human newborn baby in particular is incredibly dependent. It needs somebody to look after it for at least the first 5 or 6 years of its life, and really for the first 15 or so years of its life. And therefore it's got to be attractive, and it's got to force bonding to occur. Now, given that's the case, then it could well be that what human males do is to look at anybody in that same way and say that's a person who needs to be looked after. And it could well be that some women have exploited that process.
Dr. Chris McManus talking to Peter Evans. Now to a woman who exploited her green fingers. Catherine Angel, who was born in a suburb of Boston, grew up to be a magazine editor working on the New Yorker. But alongside that, she was, all her life, a gardener, and she wrote about gardening. Anne Jones told the story of her life on Radio 4 on Sunday. The humorist E.B. White was one of the New Yorker's most illustrious contributors. When he married Catherine, they bought a 40-acre farm in Maine, where she turned the garden into a work of art. Maine is a chilly part of the world at times, and unhappily Catherine fell on the ice, causing severe injuries, which led to incapacitating arthritis in later life. But she never allowed her disability to get in the way of her passion.
Catherine was working on her 6th gardening feature when, again, her health failed. January 2nd, 1961, was her first day of complete retirement from the magazine. On February the 5th, she was again in hospital. Then again in September, after which she contracted a rare skin complaint which meant more long stretches and painful treatment in hospital, all of which left her a semi-invalid. But her mind and her writing remained as vigorously active as ever.
No longer able to sit at a desk or a typewriter, she abandoned her study at the front of the house and took up a place at one end of the living room sofa, propped with pillows. This was the control center of the house, and soon became buried under a mountain of catalogues, books, letters, files, memoranda, Kleenex, ashtrays, and miscellany.
Although unable now to do the physical work of the garden, Catherine found solace in the spirit of the Emerson poem she'd quoted years before. All my hurts, my garden spade can heal.
She masterminded all the garden operations, sometimes directing the campaign from her hospital bed, shopping among the catalogues lavishly, but always cannily.
And critically. Not only catalogue writers were scrutinized.
Consider, too, the hybridizers. Their slogan is not only bigger and better, but change. If there is a flower with a set of delicate single petals, the hybridizers seem determined to change them, to double or triple them, curl them, ruffle them. Well, occasionally a ruffled petunia is a delight, but a ruffled snapdragon is an abomination.
And chrysanthemums?
Some of them are being turned into cactuses. What is happening to cactuses, I can't say. But I do own a plant called a poinsettia cactus, and a miserable old thing it is, full of mealybugs.
It's often been said that if you want to have a garden, don't have children or animals. Catherine had several of both, and the garden still survived, although with casualties. Andy's cows saw off a stand of lady slipper orchids, deer ate their apple crop, and there was a clematis jackmanii that suddenly turned black.
There are numerous theories in the household about this. Too much fertilizer, overwatering, underwatering. My own theory is dachshund trouble. Our dachshund is a robin and bee hound. A robust dog, he flings himself with abandon at birds, bees, and fireflies, and I believe he mortally wounded the jackmanii in a scuffle with a bee.
Kate Harper as Catherine, with Peter Marinka as her husband. Rather larger dogs than that warlike dachshund featured on this week's A Small Country Living. Janine McMullen visited the village of Brentor on Dartmoor, where Maggie Doncaster has her Clumber Spaniels. Up to now, fashion has dictated that spaniels should have their tails docked, but Maggie Doncaster has started a new trend by leaving her Clumbers intact, waving their long feathery tails behind them.
Well, this is Ankerfield Becky, who was the first Clumber to be shown at Crufts, complete with the tail.
Now, the other lady over there, dear old Bumble, has only got half a tail.
Yes, it's her mother. She's 13, and she still belonged to the era when Clumbers were automatically docked without another thought being given.
Becky's owner, Sue, is here. Does Becky appreciate the fact that she has a tail?
Well, she uses it a great deal when she's out, particularly when she's running down a hill. It's a good break. Swimming, she'd certainly be far less mobile without it. And I use it as an indication of her intention as well.
Do you? In what way?
Well, depending on the angle she's carrying it, she's either up to no good or at an innocent activity.
Now, Maggie, I think you better describe your Clumber.
They're described as a heavy dog, compared to a Springer, who is a light, up and over going dog. A Clumber is heavy, down to earth, walks with very purposeful mien, and built with a front like a tank, so they can tackle any cover. At Sandringham, for example, when George V had them, they were there because of the heavy undergrowth of rhododendron and so on, which they would tackle and lighter dogs wouldn't.
What's the history of the breed?
It's very interesting because nobody really knows the origin of the breed. There is a lovely story that they were produced in France by the Duc de Noailles, and it is said that when he thought he was going to lose his own head at the time of the French Revolution, that he rescued his entire kennel by sending them to England to the Duke of Newcastle at Clumber Park, hence the name Clumber Spaniel.
Their basic job being?
To beat. They are a finder of game, they're a putter-upper, but they're not as fast as Labradors or Springers, of course.
No, they're rather ponderous, really, aren't
They are ponderous, but they never miss anything. That's the glory, is that they don't run over things, they don't leave wounded birds.
But you don't use them as a clumber?
No, I don't now. I just enjoy walking with them. To go for a walk with a clumber is you enter into their world which finds water, which finds the hidden things. They are my walking companions. Without them, Dartmoor would be much less than it is.
Maggie Doncaster on the joys of dog walking. If you're as old as me, you'll likely remember a radio series called Up the Pole, featuring Jimmy Jewell and Ben Warris. They were quite my favourite comedians until Hancock came along. Ben Warris is now in his 70s, but he's been in the business from the age of 9, when he was described as a boy comedian. He told Mike Craig all about his early struggles on Radio 2's It's a Funny Business. Before he teamed up permanently with his cousin Jimmy, he did a show with the whole of his uncle's family. It was not a success, and after a final showdown in Doncaster, their ways parted, and Ben found himself unemployed. Then somebody suggested that he should change his act.
He said to me, "You ought to do a black-faced act, you know." So I looked at him and I said, "A black-faced act? Why?" "Well," they said, "you got big ears and a big mouth and big eyes. Roll your eyes about, put the black on." He said, "You look all right as a black-faced act." He said, "Do you know River Stay Away From My Door?" I said, "Yes." "You keep going your way." He said, "Go on, roll your eyes." "No, keep going my way. Make your mouth big." "River." I said, "That's it, that's it. If you got the black on, you look good." So he took me in the agent. He said, "Hello, John, what do you want?" He said, "I want you to give this boy a job." I said, "What is he?" He said, "He's the best blackface singer in the country." The fellow said, "What's his name?" He said, "It's Ben Warris, the blackface songster." He said, "I've never bloody heard of him." He said, "You will?" He said, "Put him in." He said, "Stick him in at Woolwich next week." He said, "But the bills..." He said, "He doesn't want any money, do you?" I said, "No, I haven't got any." He said, "Give him £3. Give him £3. You can give him £3. Let him open the bill." So he talked this man into giving me a week at Woolwich for £3, not billed, open the bill. So we left the office and we went into Charing Cross Road. He looked at me, he said, "Right, you want some black makeup, white lipstick and a suit." So he took me over behind the Hippodrome. There was a little second-hand shop. This is 1928-30. And he bought me a suit for 17 shillings, which didn't fit me. The trousers were too short and so was the jacket. That was the idea. Show the white socks and the white shirt. We went over Westminster Bridge to a little theatrical costumer's there, and we bought a grey bowler for £0.50. Got the music from Fellman's for nothing, and some black makeup, and he found a stick of white lipstick, which he gave me, and I've now done an act. So I went to Woolwich on the Monday. I went to fear and trembling. Oh dear, what a state I'm in. So the fellow looked at me, the stage door keeper. He said, "What's your name?" I said, "Ben Warris." Oh, he said, "Yeah, you're here." He said, "Ben Warris, you're not billed at first turn. You are room 10. And I'm in the room with two other fellas. And they're at the other end of the room. And I'm at this end. And obviously we're in the chorus girls' room because there's 12 mirrors. Yes. So I put this black on. Never blacked up in my life before. Never even had a try. And I bought it in a tube, you see. So I'm putting it on. And I look in the mirror. And I see two black faces looking at me. They're blacking up as well. So I turned and looked at them, and they looked at me, and I said, "Are you black?" And they said, "Are you black?" I said, "Yeah, we're all blacking up." I said, "Well, who are you?" They said, "We're the two aces." They said, "Who are you?" I said, And Ben Warris, he said, you're not on the bill. I said, no, I'm first term. So anyhow, they were fourth. So go downstairs. Show opens. Overture. River Stairway from my door, the music. On I walked. So, sang River Stairway from my door. Walking my baby back home. 3 choruses of tap routine when I was exhausted. And then tried to sing the ballad. However, I got it all out, and it was all right. I came off, the stage manager looked at me and said, have you ever done this before? I said, no. He says, you cheeky bugger. I said, I know, but you've got to start, haven't you? He said, what are you going to do now? This had fascinated him now. Just now it's all running down my face, the black all over my shirt. He said, here's 6pence, go and have a bun and a cup of coffee next door. So I went in this cafe and all the stage hands were there. Show's over, second house. Go back to the theatre, get ready, go downstairs. Stage manager's there. He said, where are you going? You're not on there. Oh, God, they shut me off the bill. He said, you're last but one. I said, what? He said, you're last but one. He said, didn't you know you did very well? I said, no. He said, well, that's where you are. As my music started and the tabs went up, the audience was singing River Stairway from My Door, which was a popular song. So they were on my side right from the start. Yeah. And I nearly stopped the bloody show.
Ben Warris on Radio 2's It's a Funny Business. An oddly similar experience to the one he described launched the career of Spike Milligan. He was on that BBC Two series, Famous Last Words, where, in a rather macabre fashion, contributors are asked in to view their own obituary and make comments about it to Peter France. The general conclusion about Spike was that he'd be remembered as a clown. Would he prefer to be remembered for something more important?
Not really, no. I think that's the part I played most in life, as being a clown. I like that. I think that's a good title. Not a comedian, no, I could say that. Being a clown is nice. I like that.
Why?
Well, because it goes back to my very first appearance. Just fortuitously, one Christmas, the nuns realized that in the nativity scene, they couldn't change the scenery quick enough. So they grabbed hold of me, the little boy of 5, and they blacked me up, put white lips on me like this, and put a pirouette costume on me with the pom-poms down here. And I had to go out, and they said, go out there and be funny. Unscripted. So I went out, and I was funny. And I heard this laughter coming. So that's what I was. The first part I played was a clown, and the nice part of it was, then Mother Superior said to me, but you mustn't go on in the nativity scene. And even though I was only 5, I thought that's wrong. So I went on at the nativity, and I took my hat off, and they all applauded. That was nice, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't mind being remembered for being a clown.
You've been through a lot of experiences in your life, and you've obviously acquired a lot of wisdom. If you were to be run over by a bus tomorrow, what would you like your last words to be?
Thank God I'm wearing clean underwear.
Spike Milligan with his famous last words. I wonder what mine will be. Goodbye now.
That was Margaret Howard with her pick of the week. The producer was Nigel Atchison.